For me, the core of what makes an NGO a grassroots NGO is how much space exists between the people within the NGO and the people outside the NGO. To me, the smaller the space is, the more grassroots the NGO is. Running an NGO in India today needs 25,000 things to do as an organization that have absolutely nothing to do with what you're doing on the ground.
Right.
If you don't have a website, it's going to be very difficult to raise funds. That I can do for you. I don't think we speak about taking care of ourselves enough in this sector. We just don't. We are all so driven by problems larger than us. This is not a scaling story. This is not a growth story. This is a story of real people with real lives and real problems that are being helped by those people.
Right.
And that's kind of the draw of those stories.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Raahi.impact Journeys. Today, I wanted to explore the question of what is a grassroots NGO and what does that world look like? So, my experience in the development sector has been largely with organizations that are working at scale, working systemically, and perhaps don't fit the definition of grassroots. Joining me today is Yashasvini Rajeshwar, who is the founder and CEO of AuxoHub, a communications consultancy for social impact organizations. Yashasvini, over the last few years, you have worked a lot with what they call grassroots NGOs. And today I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you to understand them. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, beginning with, what is the world of a grassroots NGO? What does that look like? What do you call a grassroots NGO?
I think lots of us in the sector would like a definition that is clean and the boundaries are clear for a question like that. I don't necessarily think there is one. I also don't think I am the best person to be creating one. I have had higher than average exposure to grassroots NGOs. I don't run one. AuxoHub was founded to address needs that are felt by grassroots NGOs and then has grown in some ways beyond. And so I am very much here as a reflection of stories and experiences that I have witnessed or people have shared with me. There are many, many others who are much better qualified to define this.
Absolutely.
So with that caveat, in my mind, a grassroots NGO is an NGO that works very close to the ground, definitionally, very community driven, very likely helmed by a founder who is from those circumstances. For me, the core of what makes an NGO a grassroots NGO is how much space exists between the people within the NGO and the people outside the NGO, right? So who is running the NGO, who's working at the NGO, and what communities are they working with? How much space exists between these two categories? To me, the smaller the space is, the more grassroots the NGO is.
Understood.
So typically, these are NGOs that are not metropolitan, not hyper-urban, are working with communities, very rooted, asking them questions about what are their felt needs. What does life look like for you? What does education look like for you? What does healthcare look like for you? What does aspiration look like for you? Without going in with any preconceived notions of it should be this way or it should be that way. Very often helmed by founders who come from those kinds of environments themselves or have spent many, many years in those environments and therefore have a very personal relationship with that kind of life.
Understood. And as you're talking about this, what are the sort of organizations that you're thinking of? Because I'm sure this is coming from people you've met, organizations you've seen.
There are so many. So I come from Tamil Nadu. I grew up in Chennai. Don't come from a very grassrooty background myself.
Right.
Very a product of the cities, so to speak. And therefore, a lot of my experiences are Tamil Nadu heavy.
Right.
And just as I'm talking about this, I can think of people and organizations in pretty much every district of the state who are doing this kind of work, right? They are running schools for first generation tribal children in the Nilgiris. They are helping women find their feet and financial independence in Chengalpet. They are helping nomadic tribal communities in Nagapattinam. They are helping fisher folk communities in Kanyakumari. They are people who come from those backgrounds and are working with their people to make their everyday lives a better place. This is not a scaling story. This is not a growth story. This is a story of real people with real lives and real problems that are being helped by those people.
Right.
And that's kind of the draw of those stories.
Right. And if I make it more tactical and technical, no, are these usually registered organizations, and how are they usually resourced? Is it the typical corporate hierarchical structure, like CEO, managers, associates, or is it usually more community, cooperative oriented, where there are elected leaders that keep rotating? So how is that structured?
So again, I've not founded a grassroots NGO, so caveats apply. But in my experience, these are all definitely registered organizations, because receiving funding becomes a difficulty if you aren't registered. There are activist organizations and organizations that work on a more voluntary basis, but building those and running those are a whole different conversation.
Right.
And I have a lot less exposure to that, so I definitely shouldn't be speaking about it. In the case of these organizations, they are typically registered in some shape or form. There is a founder who has felt very deeply about the problems that they see around them or challenges that need to be overcome. And so typically there is one person at the helm.
Right.
The structure is a lot less hierarchical. Because resource scarcity is a very real thing for a lot of these people. So you are unlikely to find a communications team and an accounts team and a fundraising team.
Right.
There just aren't enough people for these teams.
Right.
Very implementer heavy. So most of your staff are field staff. They're actually going out and doing the work and implementing the programs and talking to the communities. Your admin staff are very few, if at all, probably just the founder wearing 25 different hats at the same time. But in terms of hierarchies, I have always seen it to be a fairly flat hierarchy, because everybody belongs to that community. Everybody comes with lived experiences of these problems, of these questions that you're tackling. And so there is always space for those conversations and that negotiation, so to speak, of what can we do, what should we do, how should we do it, all of these sticky questions.
And what would you say is the funding sources, and typically how is this enterprise run?
Difficult. Unfortunately, the getting access to funding gets increasingly difficult the farther away from socio-political power centers, basically, which is typically a capital city. Right. So if you're taking Tamil Nadu, then the farther away from Chennai you go, the harder it is to raise funds. If you're taking a national average, the farther away from a Delhi you go, the harder it is to get attention and funds.
Or Mumbai.
Yeah. So that is definitely true for a lot of these organizations. They are registered and they will have all of their paperwork for tax exemption, etc. But it is probably one of the biggest, most insurmountable battles that grassroots founders have to gain sustainable sources of funding. So a lot of the conversations that we have within social impact circles about what kind of work environment are you building, are we able to pay our people fairly, is very far removed from some of these conversations, because being able to pay people full stop is something that doesn't happen with confidence. I get calls fairly regularly saying, we don't know where salary money is going to come for the next 2 months. Is there something that you can help us with? And that's kind of that instability, but also that commitment to still being rooted in the community is almost a thing that I think many grassroots organizations will understand and will feel a part of.
And if I double down a little bit there, right? What would, if you're talking about typical organization in that space, what would be the sort of issues that would be top of mind for them? Let's say externally first, and then internally.
Internally, externally also speak to each other. I don't think they're two different lists. So fundraising, but fundraising is, why is fundraising a problem? Fundraising is a problem because you're very far away from power centers, but it is also a problem because who is doing this fundraising, right? It's almost always the founder who is in charge of fundraising. How many things is the founder in charge of? The founder is also in charge of making sure Receipts are getting sent to every donor. The founder is also in charge of training the staff. The founder is also in charge of compliance. The founder is also in charge of talking to the auditor. The founder is in charge of making sure the funders are receiving their documents. Pretty much everything that is happening administratively, the founder is in charge of. So if I am a grassroots founder and I have to also now be in charge of building the networks, having the conversations, following up with the conversations, that is a whole job basically. But it's only one part of my job, right? The second is also a skill gap. For a lot of these founders, all of these founders, I would hazard a guess, did not start their organizations because they were great salespeople.
Right.
They started their organizations because they cared for their people and felt this fire inside their belly to say, I can help fix this, or I can help change, kind of shift the needle just a little bit. But fundraising is fundamentally sales, right? So the skill set in itself is a whole different skill set.
Right.
One added layer to this is that in the Indian context, a lot of this sales fundraising happens in English, which is a pain point for people who are very community driven.
Right.
And then you have consultants who will come in and help, but then you have an affordability question. If I have a resource crunch, am I going to spend 20,000 rupees on that consultant, or am I going to spend 20,000 rupees paying somebody's salary next month? The answer is a little self-evident in that situation, but you then get caught in this resource crunch loop. Another big problem is, even if you can afford consultants are fundamentally outsiders. How much of the real context of your work is going to be transferable to an external consultant will always be a challenge. You can't just swoop down, have 2 hours of a conversation, feel like you get it,
right,
and then go and fundraise. So all of these various things, I think. So this kind of bridges the internal and external gap.
Sure.
So those, in my mind, these are threads of conversation that I keep hearing again and again.
And are there organizations which seem content, where they are stable and they are not? Because a lot of what you're saying sounds like resource scarcity, stress, and a lot of focus on running 20 machines at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? So just wondering, are there examples that come to mind of people who are like, this is enough, we've got some basic sources of funding sorted, we've got our community clear, and we will, there is a rhythm that they have found.
Yeah. If I take a minute, I can think of a few people,
Sure.
Not very many. And I think that comes from a fundamental sectoral fire, right? I feel like everybody who works in this space has a bit of that.
Yeah.
Because we're all looking at chipping at an iceberg that is so much bigger than any one organization is ever going to be.
Right.
So if I'm running a school, I'm never going to say, educating 150 kids is enough. Right? Because there are 15,000 yet to receive access to that kind of quality. So with that contentment, I think also comes a little bit of guilt that founders need to navigate, right? How do you say it's enough?
Right.
There are people who say it's enough to geographies. I will do everything for this community.
Right.
I will do everything for this village. I will do everything for this neighborhood.
Right.
But it's still everything. It's not just, I will just educate just the children on this street. Is never going to be what an organization is going to say.
Right. Fair enough. Is this something that you think is already also happening globally, or is this a very India, or where does this cut? Honestly, I actually don't know.
That's a great question. I also don't know enough to make globally generalized statements. I imagine it would be similar in any context with plurality. And by that I mean, a Grassroot NGO in Tamil Nadu is doing very different work than a Grassroot NGO in Jharkhand, which is doing very different work from a Grassroot NGO in Maharashtra. And therefore, being able to bring all these people together is fundamentally limited. Right? So in any context where you have that kind of difference, I would imagine this kind of splintering would happen.
Understood.
Right? In contexts where you and I have more in common than we have differences, it's easy to bring both of us together.
Right.
But if my world is so different from your world, then it's not possible to run this together.
Right. And I guess also what you said around language barriers and being able to connect, and lack of time and bandwidth. So
100%. In a lot of ways, I think that's also one of those things that all of us feel when we work in the sector, but maybe not always have the bandwidth to engage with, which is, we're all sitting and really working hard at some of these problems. we don't often know what other people are doing for the same problems around the corner. Right? Because it's not a formalized industry in that sense. So you don't have platforms where you're only networking.
Right.
Given the scale of the problem, we also don't feel like we have the time to be only networking. And so in some ways, it's also very, I don't want to say lonely because it's not, it's fundamentally people driven, but it's very me in my world, so to speak.
Right. I think I understand what a Grassroots NGO looks like, but if you could also share a couple of stories so that in my head I have a visual,
Sure.
Right? That would be helpful.
So I'll tell you my founding story, right? It's the story that I have spoken about plenty with my team, and it's also the story that I really go back to every time I'm thinking about why do I do what I do.
Right.
Before I founded AuxoHub, I was teaching, and I was teaching at a school that was run by an NGO. So it was a private school, so to speak, but it was an NGO-run school. The founder of that school was a teacher at heart. Like, you put her in a room with 8-year-olds and nothing will make her happier. Right? That's it. That's bread, butter, sunshine, everything is in that space.
Sure.
Right? Because it was also not urban, finding teachers to come into that school was very difficult. You'd have local teachers, but if you're also looking at specialized commerce or geography for 12th standard, then you also are looking at people with a specific background, etc. And therefore, drawing from your immediate resources becomes difficult. So you're looking at people coming from outside, and that's a challenge. Inevitably, what ended up happening is that the principal would teach. So she would be in classrooms. And that is what made her the happiest. Like, she would be glowing when she came out of it. Right? But also, she will be the one who's writing the emails to your board. She will be the one writing the proposal that is due tomorrow because nobody ever has more time. Right? She will be the one doing the correction of the 4 classes that she has taught, which is 25 into 400 notebooks that you have to get through. Right? She will be the one who, she will be the one who's, anchoring the teacher training. She will be the one sitting with the kitchen staff to figure out what lunch menus to make. This is a lady who's doing all of this. And this is a lady who began the school after retirement. Right? So she is also much older, and therefore there are just physical energy requirements that you need to take into account. When I joined the school, I came from an urban background. I had language. So I was able to take some of these things off her plate and do some of this writing. Not a part of my job, but it was an easy fix for me, right? It took very little effort for me to be able to add that much more value. Very soon, I realized this was something I could do for others. Right? I could get on the phone with you and ask you verbally, what is this project that you want to implement? And I guarantee you will know every detail that you need to know. But the second you look at it as a MNC's foundations proposal template, it asks you to say the exact same thing in a particular language. It will ask you, what is your theory of change? What is your theory of change? If I were to break that down into language that you actually understand, if I ask you, why are you doing what you're doing? You will know. But if I ask you, what is your outcome impact indicator, then everybody's a little like, oh no.
Freeze.
It's not so much that you don't know. It's that you struggle to say it. It's a problem of translation. Right? That was my founding story. I came out thinking, if I could help my principal, why can't we help that many more people?
Because it also unlocks their ability to do the remaining things.
In my mind, the most joyous part of what I do at work is not that I am writing reports for NGOs, right? That's not the most glamorous job. Let's be honest. What excites me is that I'm able to free up founders' time to do what they actually want to do. Because no founder wants to write the report. Right? I am the organization that was set up to write reports. They are not.
So actually, this might actually be a good segue. Where are you placed in this space, right? Among Grassroots NGOs, what do you do? What do AuxoHub do?
Where am I placed? I like to think of it as the PA's desk. And I know this is not the most glamorous.
Not the most glamorous definition.
But it's okay. I'm okay being not glamorous. And that also has roots in the fact that when it comes to deeply rooted impact work, I'm not the best person to do it. There are people who know more than me, are better than me, come from stronger backgrounds than me, understand more than me. They should be empowered, they should have resources, they should have bandwidth to do the work. And if there are parts of their work that I can take away to then create that bandwidth, that is my success.
Right.
So when I was teaching, I didn't understand the community as much as some of my colleagues did.
Right.
I didn't grow up there. I don't truly comprehend how difficult it is for that child to come to the class. I can be empathetic, but I didn't grow up with that, you know? And so I would tell teachers, you know what? I will help you write your lesson plans. You just tell me. The rest of it, you're so much better than I am.
Right.
Right?
Right.
In my mind, AuxoHub is an extension of that same principle. I'm not here to do the work. I'm here to help you do the work. And by that, I'm not here to assist in project implementation, because who am I to assist in your project implementation? I am here to help you clear out the weeds a little bit. Because running an NGO in India today needs 25,000 things to do as an organization that have absolutely nothing to do with what you're doing on the ground.
Right.
If you don't have a website, it's going to be very difficult to raise funds.
Correct.
Because if you don't have an internet presence, then who are you? That I can do for you.
Right.
Right? That's who I am. I am the person that you can dump all of this reading, writing stuff on, and we will make sense of it for you. And we will make sense of it together, because I can lay claim to the writing, and nobody can lay claim to the community more than you can.
Understood.
Right?
And so is it that you kind of accepted the reality that you do need funds and you do need to connect both across languages and across terms, jargon, to be able to access those funds? Is that primarily one of the use cases that I would look at, or are you?
Yes, that was also the primary use case that we began with. I think as we've grown, some of the other use cases have also been, we've been able to kind of hold the mirror up to founders who haven't had the time to stop and think.
Which happens when
A lot, right? Is this working? Do we need to do more? Do we need to do less? Do we need to do different? If we are coming in as external consultants, I am best positioned to ask you those questions.
Right.
And by virtue of answering me, you are thinking about it.
Right.
What I do with that answer is secondary now.
Right.
Right? For those 10 minutes, you've paused to reflect. And that's 10 minutes more than, like, in the frenzy of actually doing the work,
Right.
that 10 minutes is very hard to come back.
Right.
So in terms of actual tangible, we basically do a lot of the comms work for NGOs. So we do their report writing, we make the annual reports, we make the websites, we make the impact reports, the needs assessments, the proposal writing, the social media, all of that. Anything that you need to be written as a voice of an NGO, we are happy to do it for you.
Got it. And what would you say is the dynamic that was there when you began and the dynamic that is there now? Because I remember when you was just starting out, I think one of the things that you had told me is that a lot of people believe that it is not possible to run sustainably when you are supporting grassroots NGOs, and I want to prove that wrong, or I want to try to give it a shot. So how did that go?
Yeah, it was definitely a very loud voice around me when we began. You put it very politely. People have said that in much less polite terms. But broad strokes, I think we've been successful. Recently, somebody asked me, what's your biggest success as an entrepreneur? And instinctively, my answer was survival. Like, we're here, 6 years on, I have built a team around me. This is not just me doing this by myself anymore. Today, the Indian impact sector has grown enough to support organizations like me. We all get paid our salaries. We're all like paying bills. We're all doing these things. However, caveats is that part of the growth journey of AuxoHub was also realizing that the problems that we are solving are not limited to grassroots organizations.
Right.
Larger organizations have comms teams, but I guarantee you the comms team will always be smaller than what you need it to be.
Absolutely.
Right?
And often I think comms teams are usually the last team, at least in my experience, that you have the privilege in the space to actually hire.
Absolutely.
Right? And often comms and fundraising start off together.
Correct. Marketing, social media, comms, fundraising.
Anything that has words in it. Right?
You know the words, people.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. And so we realized that approach might be slightly different, but fundamental problem statement is shared across the sector.
Right.
So today I cannot say that we only service grassroots organizations.
Sure. So,
We try to make sure we have a foot in that world because that's where we began and my heart is very much there. But we definitely have grown to service organizations across sizes.
so essentially, does it become like a cross subsidization in a very, very small way, I guess?
Yes and no. What a larger NGO needs is very different from what a smaller NGO needs.
Right.
I'm also very conscious of not over-engineering the problem.
Sure.
I don't want to go to a grassroots NGO and say you need 6 different reports to fix 6 different problem statements for 7 different funders. Very often they don't need that. They need one comprehensive deck that can do 20 different things for them. Right? Whereas a larger NGO might have a use case that requires a little bit more diversity, a little bit more nuance, right? And so I don't think we've ever cross-subsidized in that sense. It's just that the larger NGOs have more layered deliverables that they're looking for. They have slightly higher order. The grassroots NGOs are very rarely looking at an impact report, for example, because it is further down the road than, say, a pitch deck would be.
Fair enough.
So what we do for organizations has evolved, not so much a cross-subsidization.
And if I may, because it's if you say the last 6 years, that's essentially pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? So more for a grassroots NGO, what was that world like during that period, and where has it reached today? I mean, to the extent that you're comfortable guessing.
Yeah, it is an educated guess, I think, is how I would position this. There is a certain level of instability that took root during COVID because funding almost dried up overnight unless you had some kind of a foot in the health door. And I don't think that instability has gone away. The rest of the world talks about a post-COVID world.
Right.
But we haven't quite recovered to that point in the last, it's been 2 years-ish since, vaguely.
In that ballpark. Yeah.
And some of it is also the legalities of it and, things that have been happening with CSR laws and how difficult that has been for fundraising, etc. So I think there is a fundamental nature of instability that forms the foundation of how grassroots NGOs work, right? I know grassroots NGOs who, for example, have projects on standby. Like they're ready. They're like a plug-and-play turnkey approach, right? Where they're like, if we get funding, we can start tomorrow.
Right.
If we don't get funding, we can't.
Right.
And there are staff who are project staff who may get funding and therefore get employment, may not. Right. Sometimes you're able to absorb them in other projects, sometimes you're not. So the economics of it is fascinating in that are people who are working for grassroots NGOs looking at it as a source of employment? Or is it primarily a source of impact? Like, are you doing it because you're making a difference or are you doing it as a job?
Right.
That also might be a fundamental difference between slightly larger NGOs and this, because in the last 10 years, I think, or 15 years, I think Indian social impact has evolved to the bigger NGOs being able to be career options. Right? I don't know whether grassroots workers will necessarily feel the same way.
And so is it that they have a field also on the side? Is it that they have 2 jobs essentially? That this is also part of their day job, but their source of income and stability comes from a different place?
I think intuitively my answer to that question is also to take a step back and fundamentally recognize that the way that people understand work is very different, right? So for me, a job means Monday to Friday, I have a desk and I'm there broadly between 10 and 6.
Right.
And I get a salary at the end of every month for doing this job. I don't think the way that urban work is perceived is the same way that it is perceived in many other contexts. So there is a lot of conversation in more urban social sector, for example, where we are talking about work-life balance in the social sector. I shouldn't be able to answer calls on a Sunday morning because I have a life outside of my job. I don't think that rhetoric carries forward. Right? Because for a lot of people, their life and their job are not as distinct as some of us who are having this conversation are making it out.
Right.
So, sure, you might have something on the side, you might be taking tuition classes, you might be doing something else. But if you were to ask them, I don't think they would say I have 2 jobs.
Right.
You know,
This is the stuff I do.
this is just how we live life.
Right. And I guess along this line of thought itself, what would be, say, 2 or 3 myths that people have, or things that when you look at the picture from far away, this is the stereotype, this is the rhetoric, but over the years you've come to realize that maybe we should relook those?
My biggest one would be the language and the power dynamic that we use when we talk about grassroots workers, right? A lot of the conversation in the social impact space is by urban folks, fundamentally. And instinctively, there is a underlying sense of, oh, but poor them instability, poor them lower salaries, poor them maybe you're not getting it credited on the first of every month, right? I think the reality is more that there are two, it's not comparable in the stereotypical apples to oranges kind of space, right? The way that an urban, perhaps corporate, whatever individual is thinking about life is very different from how community organizations are thinking about life. How much do you need? What is success? What is professional growth? Are so drastically different that we should really be careful to not use urban metrics to judge their lives. Right? I am nobody to say you are adjusting or you are compromising. Right. Because that automatically means I am saying this is what you should be and you are there. Right. So that is the compromise. Right. And that's fundamentally flawed.
Right. And if I were to also, if I'm a viewer or a listener of this, what would be one way that I could engage with this space, I guess? And again, since we're speaking in English, since we are having this conversation online, I'm guessing the profile of the people who are listening in may not be those who necessarily are in the heartland of India. So what would you say? What are some ways that they can engage?
Engagement can look like many different things, right? It doesn't need to be, oh, I will go and do 2 weeks somewhere. Yeah. If you can, please do. It is life-changing. Engagement can be following a couple of pages on Instagram. Just so that when you're doom scrolling before sleeping, you're changing up what kind of content you consume. Right? So that you remind yourself that your way to live is not the only way to live.
Right.
Right? That's it. That's the extent of your engagement. Is the grassroots workers' life changing because of this? No, but it doesn't have to.
But your life is.
Your life is. Enough.
Right?
Engagement can be asking questions. Just the really small questions. What does your day at work look like? It's very easy for us to assume, oh, you go to village and do this.
Right.
Right? Where are these assumptions coming from is very shaky.
Right.
If given the opportunity, ask people questions. And that is not necessarily grassroots workers. I think anybody at all this holds true, but definitely even within the social impact space. There's such a vast variety of people who are doing such different things.
Yeah.
That just be like, what is it that you do? Right? The nature of the problems is so complicated that education workers in point A and education workers in point B will be doing very different things.
Right.
Right? A sense of curiosity and a willingness to explore worlds that are not yours in whatever limited capacity you can, given your own life. Right? Not all of us can make broad strides to do drastically different things. I think that's a great place to start engagement.
And if I come to the final part of what's been on my mind, which is if I look at you as a person and a professional, what have been some maybe 2 learnings and 1 regret that you have had over the last many years now? I think you've been engaging on this.
Learnings, I think curiosity that I spoke about is very much a personal learning. I think just like everybody else, all of us have our biases. We try to position that we don't, but we do. And to just basically make sure that every conversation that I come to, I check myself and say, do I know this? And do I know this because you've told me? Or do I know this because I just think I know it?
Right.
Right? Has definitely been something that I constantly remind myself in this job. The other big success slash learning for me is also around people. In a world where we're talking a lot about digitalization and AI tech and the rest of it, this is a sector that's pretty much made by its people, right? We're not a high tech sector.
Right.
We exist because there are hundreds and thousands of people in this country who've decided, I want to do something to leave the world a better place. And this sounds idealistic, and we joke about it internally a lot.
Right.
But fundamentally, we all have that little bit in us to be like, I want it to matter.
Right.
Right? My greatest learning and greatest joy has been surrounding myself with some of those people. On days that this work is hard, because it is, on days that you feel like you're chipping away at a mountain that's so much bigger than anything that any of us can individually do, it is those people that are keeping ourselves afloat.
Yeah.
Right? It can be your teams, it can be clients, it can be people that you know, right? All of us fundamentally get it.
Right.
And that's a success, but it's also a learning on the bad days where you feel like you're in this alone. To be like, but you're not actually. The greatest regret is both personal, but is also larger than me. I don't think we speak about taking care of ourselves enough in this sector. We just don't. We are all so driven by problems larger than us that we don't realize that every day of our jobs, we are coming face to face with the stickiest, most complex problems that we face as a society today. Every day you're talking about malnutrition. Every day you're talking about gender violence. Every day you're talking about enrollment rates and learning outcomes. Every day you're talking about climate change. We wake up in the morning and we do this. Whether we realize it or not, it is emotionally exhausting.
Right.
I wish I had realized this earlier than I have. I wish I had given myself the grace earlier than I have to be like, sometimes it can be just a job. Sometimes it doesn't need to be a mission.
Right.
So that you water the plant and then you come back and it becomes the mission again. Right? Because there is a fundamental fire and that's why we're all here. But sometimes the fire needs to be I have a Tamil word in my head, but it needs to katti kapati fed, right? It needs to be protected, it needs to be fed, it needs to be, and then we will all come back and we'll be better for it. But it's a real thing. We need to protect our people to protect the sector.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate this. Thank you everyone for watching, and again, this has been a useful, short but insightful conversation about Grassroot NGOs and what that world looks like. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
So please do feel free to share this episode with others, to hit the subscribe button like I always share, and do drop a comment below if you have thoughts on this topic, and if there's any voice that you would like to share that is either yours or someone who works in a Grassroots NGOs, because like Yashasvini said, this is actually a multitude of sectors within the sector, and it would be lovely to hear many different voices. Thank you so much.
Thank you.